I'm Doug White, the Academic Director of the Heyman Center, and as we continue building yet another story this weekend, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Every one of you who have come in so far have in front of you a newspaper. Many of you recognize this newspaper. It's the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Many of you don't know a day when this newspaper did not exist. It has only been around for a little over 20 years. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of time for many of you, but for many of us, that's a relatively short period of time. And it's important to know this because we in the world of philanthropy, at the Heyman Center especially, are trying to think about ways to make what we do a true profession. That's why we have our master's courses. That's why we have our continuing education courses. This was Naomi Levine's dream in starting the Heyman Center, to make this a profession, to make this a world-changing occupation. But you know, until 20 years ago, we didn't really know who was doing what in the world of philanthropy. We would find out eventually, but there was really no central place where we could go and learn about what another university is doing, what another arts or cultural organization is doing. But in late 1988, this nascent publication began. And as it turns out, I got a call in February of 1989 from a woman I had never heard of to tell me about a publication I had never heard of, to ask me to write a column about planned giving and ethics. This was 20 years ago now, 22 years ago. And as it turns out, she said, I don't think you've ever heard of us, and I know you have never heard of me, but this is a big deal. And you know what? This organization and this publication is a big deal. And since day one, there has been one person who's been steering the direction of this publication, the Chronicle of Philanthropy. This one person who probably more than anyone else in the United States today can tell us what is going on in the world of philanthropy, because she has her pulse on almost everything that's going on. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you today that person, Stacy Palmer from the Chronicle of Philanthropy.
Okay, I follow great speakers and I know everything. I think I'm going to go sit down now before I disappoint all of you. Thank you so much for a lovely introduction. And it's fun for me to be back here. One of my first assignments as a Chronicle of Higher Education reporter, where I started before the Chronicle of Philanthropy even happened or was even an idea, was to cover NYU. And I got to cover John Bradamus. And I was thrilled to be able to see a politician in the role of college president and to write about that and to see this university's transformation and to get to know people like Naomi. So it's really just a delight to be here and to be with you. I really want this to be a conversation, so I'm going to quickly go over what I see as 10 of the top things happening in the world of fundraising, but I'd love to have us talk about it, and I know Naomi is going to follow up with some comments as well. And I think we're very much in sync with each other, and I hadn't talked to her about this until I heard her say the same thing yesterday that I had already planned to say as my opening thing about what's going on in fundraising. Obviously, the economy is the biggest thing that is happening, but it's a real test of the American model, and she will talk more about that. But to me, it's a test of whether it really does work. Yes, it's very wonderful that fundraising was about exactly the same last year as it was the year before. $300 billion, if you believe the estimates of Indiana University. So that's a great thing and a great accomplishment. On the other hand, we have never seen in this country giving go up really more than a percentage of national income by any meaningful way. So in good times and in bad, it's about the same percentage of national income. We've gotten better at fundraising, but somehow we're not getting better at really increasing that percentage of giving. At the same time, we're seeing enormous competition. The fact that all of you are here is part of that. And it's also a very exciting thing as more voices come into the fundraising world and there are more possibilities. But it also challenges us to find new sources of money and to bring new people into this process, new ideas, new innovation. And that will really be the test of whether this model works, is if we're able to really increase the number of voices and the number of people who are thinking about giving, volunteering, and getting involved in the nonprofit enterprise. One of the things a lot of fundraisers from America are doing is certainly traveling abroad. And you certainly know that by listening to John Sexton. One of the fundraisers told us, I come to New York and I get depressed. I go to Shanghai, that's a different story. Then I have fun and I have success. So it's going both ways, obviously. Some of you are coming here to learn to raise money and to do the raising of money, but we're all going around the world, and fundraising is becoming a very global phenomenon. So it will be an interesting test to see whether it really is the American model or whether it's as much as we all learn from you about what is really going on. And so that's what's really the excitement to me of this conference. The second thing that's going on that's sort of related to the economy, certainly, is the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots in the world of fundraising. When I said that fundraising is doing better, or as the economy grows, and it's pretty good that, flat was a good thing, it is the biggest institutions that are the ones that are doing well. And especially as the economy is beginning to recover, we see a growing divide between the kinds of institutions that are doing well and those that are not. There have been a couple $100 million gifts announced in the past couple of weeks, which is a good sign that the year is starting off well. But they've gone to very big health institutions and universities. They're not going to the very neediest of organizations. And one of the things that people who work at food banks, at United Ways, at the kinds of places that provide social services say, is that people have been giving for 4 or 5 years and heard about great needs, and they don't feel like they're getting solved. And so they are starting to give up. And they are starting to wonder, really, the economy is getting better. Maybe people are doing better, and maybe they don't need this as much. Well, we all know that this Great Recession has really transformed the way the economy works. Many people don't have jobs, still are in great need, and will be for a very long time. And so we have to find ways to be able to close this divide so that everybody is able to share in this generosity. Or else, again, the American model doesn't work very well, because it should be about lifting all of us up in various ways. One of the wonderful things that we can see, however, is that certainly as the economy has gotten bad, that has changed donors, even to the very elite institutions, to think about how they give. Instead of looking so much at buildings and that kind of thing, you see a lot more aid going to scholarships, and people really seeing that that's the way to succeed, to really help young students. That's what makes people excited. Indiana did an amazing thing that we don't think has been done in history. They closed a $1 billion campaign one day and started a $1 billion campaign the next day. And they say that one of the reasons they were able to do that is because they really put this emphasis on the scholarship argument, really saying that that's where most of the money was going to go. It wasn't going to go to these new buildings, much as they may need some of those things. What really was important was the scholarships, and it worked. It was a compelling argument to donors. And that's the way institutions are resizing themselves in the recession, to think about what is it that is going to motivate the donor most. And it's a different kind of thing than it used to be. The third thing that is changing is the generational shift. And we know that in many different ways in our society, and certainly we are seeing it in the world of philanthropy. We just released our Philanthropy 50, which is the list of the 50 most generous donors in the United States. And for the first time, we had somebody who was 26 years old on that list. You all know who that is, Mark Zuckerberg, who gave $100 million. And you can see that it's the issue you have in front of you that has that list. So that's a pretty remarkable thing to have somebody that young on the list. What was also remarkable was that he gave to an institution that he was not connected with. Typically, when people start getting involved in giving at that age, at least it's something that they're familiar with. But he was persuaded by various people that it was more important to go fix the Newark schools. He didn't grow up in Newark. He had nothing to do with it. But he met people who had intriguing ideas, and he wanted to do something about it. There are people who question the merits of the gift and whether it's smart or not smart. the jury is out on that. But it is a different kind of giving, I think, than we typically see with people so young. And I think it's a sign of what we can expect in this generation, especially because as you look at the way donor patterns go, most of the people on our list gave to colleges and universities. But the people who are under 50, not one of them made a gift of more than $5 million to a university. And one of the people we quoted saying, I can't imagine an institution less needy than Harvard, where he went to school. I don't know anybody who would give to a college. They just wouldn't do this. This was a hedge fund manager who, really couldn't imagine the idea of wanting to go that way. And what that's about is a changing view of institutions and the kind of organizations that need support. I worry about this in a lot of ways because we're recreating a lot of things that have done well in the name of we just have to start new. But there is a lot of fresh thinking. So whether you're from an established institution or a not so established institution, you need to realize that donors are looking in very different ways at really how to think about things. And we do see really this sign of a big change coming along that we'll see how it plays out, but certainly it's a different mindset and a different giving pattern so far. We also, at the other end of the spectrum, in the United States, there's a great aging going on where baby boomers will be getting older and older, and we are all expecting very long lifetimes. That's going to change the giving trajectory rather dramatically. When now people are talking about the old versus the old, and of course, as baby boomers, none of us will ever be old, because we will not allow that term to be used to describe us, no matter whether we're 115. But it will change the way people think about things and the way they think about their giving patterns for sure. And that's something that we all need to be aware of, so much to the point that we know some fundraisers who are getting degrees in gerontology because they feel that they need to really understand as much as they can about the aging process and what it is that people are thinking about what they're going through, and that will bring both the understanding and the compassion and the need for services, but also some ethical issues as people get older, to really think about what is the appropriate way to raise money. So I think it's going to be a fascinating time to watch these generational shifts going on in the world of philanthropy. The fourth trend is the rise of the individual. And we certainly see growing attention to raising money from individuals. After all, that's where the money is. At least 80% of donations come from individuals. There's always a lot of attention to foundations and corporations, and they're extremely important. And I know you have sessions on that at various points here. But the individuals are the ones who have the money and have the capacity to give. And many of them have been overlooked, in particular, women, who often do not get solicited nearly as much by fundraisers, yet new research has shown that women give more than men in every income category there is. They give to all kinds of causes, and all of these stereotypes that we have about women and their giving patterns turn out not to be so true. Now, some of the researchers who look at women say women themselves are the ones who have gotten in the way. In part, they tend to not want to put their names on things. They have shied away from doing that. There are some pioneering women who are starting to change that model and put their names on their giving. But women themselves will need to change their mindset. But fundraisers will also need to change. I had lunch recently with a woman who is worth at least $200 million, which she was not shy about telling me about 2 seconds into lunch. What she wanted to talk to me about was the fact that she thought she'd been treated horribly by everybody in the world of fundraising, and that fundraisers ignored her in favor of the men, and that they should take her a little bit more seriously. So I think that it's a mindset that's going to need to change. For those of you who want to know more about some of the things that work and don't work, there's a wonderful new book on women in philanthropy by some scholars who have been studying this for a long time. You probably know them, Martha Taylor and Sandra Shaw. And I recommend reading it because it has a lot of really useful tips about thinking about this really untapped resource. The other untapped resource is the entrepreneurs. They give 3 times as much as people who earned their wealth in other ways. And yet people don't really sort of look very carefully at their donor lists or the people who are interested in them and think about that as a potential giving source. So when you're looking at who it is you want to solicit, think hard about those people who built their own businesses, who have really come and thought about things in a different way. They're interested in helping you build as well. and that's usually part of the reason that they give. So it's very important to look at those kinds of things. Indiana University does a study commissioned by Bank of America every year that looks at giving by the very wealthiest people in the country. And there are a lot of trends in there that I recommend looking at, because it really speaks to not just the giving by the wealthy, but really what's going on in various donors' minds. The fifth trend, which sort of relates to that, is the demanding donor. And we see a great number of them. Naomi was saying yesterday that she doesn't think that that's any different, that donors have been demanding ever since she's been in fundraising, and I think she's right. But I do think that in part, they are getting more and more demanding because fundraisers are catering to their needs very much and really trying to talk about what's in it for the donor. And as that happens, sometimes some donors get the idea that it's still my money, even when I have written a check to an institution. There are some funny stories that happen. There's a donor who just recently challenged Stevens College. She wanted the college president to lose weight, and the rest of the student body as well. But she had a specific challenge for the college president, and she was going to give $1 million if they lost weight in a certain period of time. Now, the institution went along with it because they decided really this was about healthy living and that's what they should be doing. But the fact that donors are starting to think of those kinds of demands is really a kind of a different thing than I think we've seen. More disturbing, perhaps, was a recent incident at the University of Connecticut where a donor got mad at the football coach and thought that he was a horrible football coach, and that the institution was not listening to him about the way he was running the football department. And he said, I would like my $3 million back for the institution that you have built and put my name on it already. Please write the check back. This got a great deal of talk, not just in the philanthropy world, but on every sports channel that there was. And he finally backed down after the institution explained to him why that really wasn't going to happen, and that was not a good idea. But he caused such an uproar and gave people the idea that it's still his money. And the institution had to find a way to explain that, no, you give to something that you have a shared relationship with. We've also seen these kinds of flaps emerge as the economy has changed. A number of institutions have really found that they need to change the way a gift works. Somebody gave money for a certain cause and the institution cannot afford to maintain it anymore. Brandeis University got caught in a very difficult situation when it wanted to sell works in its museum, and the donor's family got very upset about that. We see those kinds of things happening, and I expect to see more of that as the economy continues to be difficult for many institutions. And what it's raised is really the need to make sure that everybody's clear about what goes on when a gift is negotiated. And so I think that, donors need to understand that it's not always a good idea to put restrictions on things, and that has to be part of the conversation, making that an essential ingredient. The president of Tufts University said the other day when he was talking about these demanding donors that he tries to change the conversation because he doesn't really think that that's what it should be about. And one of the things he says is, don't tell me about what you want to do. Tell me about how I can transform the leadership of this institution and and achieve your goals. But shifts it to the institution itself, not too much about the donor. Really try to change the conversation and be ready to walk away from the gift if the demands are just too much. The sixth big change is technology. And we could talk all day about the way technology is transforming fundraising, obviously. But in some ways, it's not transforming it as much as it's reinforcing the most essential things. One of the things that everybody gets upset about is the people in technology who will say, just ask for money. That's all it is about, is just a quicker way to ask for money. And then the experts say, no, it's about forming relationships first online and then moving on to asking for the gift. Well, that's the lesson that everybody in fundraising has learned all along. It's not about technology. But we sort of think technology is this different kind of thing and it's going to be a very efficient transaction, when really what's most important and most exciting about the kinds of things that are going on, especially using social networks, is that people are getting engaged and involved in a way that they never have before. They're also getting informed and entertained in different kinds of ways. There's a homeless charity in North Carolina that just started a game that helps people walk through what it's like to be a homeless person and make all the various choices that they need to make throughout the month. And you go through it all, and then at the end you're encouraged to give or volunteer because you have become made aware of all of the problems that are going on. But it's done in a very interactive, different, engaging kind of way. It's aimed at younger donors who think about giving that way. Those are the kinds of changes that institutions need to make to start thinking about how donors want to get information. They don't want those brochures and those glossy things, and they're certainly never going to look at a direct mail appeal. These are the kinds of ways to inform people now. So while online giving itself has not become something where only 10 to 20% of gifts are probably given online, it's growing fast, and it will change things in many ways. It's also changing the way people think about institutions. A lot of nonprofits that have been most successful online have been things like Kiva, Donors Choose, those kinds of groups where there's a direct relationship with an individual, where you are giving the loan, or so they say, to a particular person. And we see a lot of established institutions now modeling that. World Vision offers the same kind of thing that Kiva does now, and it's been very successful. So borrowing some of those ideas from the upstarts is a really good idea. Number 7 is the giving pledge. That's Warren Buffett and Bill and Melinda Gates going out and telling all these wealthy people that they should give away at least half their fortunes. It's a very powerful message to be able to say that. It hasn't worked so much yet in terms of getting people to give. One of the things we noticed when we did our list of the biggest donors in philanthropy, that very few of them were the people who had signed the giving pledge, and very few of them were on the Forbes 400 list of the wealthiest people in America. So they're still not necessarily giving. But what's much more important about the pledge is that it's raising a conversation point. It's getting people to think about how much money should I be giving? And it's a great way to open conversations with your donors to talk about these things. And certainly, as they plan to travel around the world to spread this message, it will give an opportunity to talk about giving in a way that hasn't happened before. When Warren Buffett made the announcement initially that he was giving a good chunk of his fortune to the Gates Foundation, one of the things that happened that nobody really expected was that lots of other people decided to call the Gates Foundation and say, can I give my fortune or my $10 or whatever to you too, and maybe you'll give it away. And you would think that, given how sophisticated the fundraising apparatus is in the United States, that people wouldn't feel, they would have known how to give before. But many of them had never thought about giving in a really serious way until they saw Warren Buffett say, wait a minute, I'm giving it to somebody else to give away for me because I like what they're doing. And people said, well, if it's good enough for Warren Buffett, it should be good for me. So the Gates Foundation had to start accepting money. And it wasn't just from very wealthy people, it was from Girl Scout troops that would raise money and say, we really want you to give it away. So the power of example is just tremendous. And I think that that's what will be truly important if the Giving Pledge is to work. It needs to go way beyond those billionaires and affect the thinking throughout many, many people. The 8th trend is a return to the basics. In this bad economy, almost everybody has found that it's really important to stick to some of the things that have always worked really well. One of the key things, thanking donors. All of a sudden, people realized we haven't done such a good job at stewardship, and maybe people aren't so loyal. So I see a lot of return to really thinking about how to make sure that people even get that basic of a thank you. And one of the things they've been doing in a lot of places is getting board members, other people to make those thank you calls. And guess what? The board members love it because they're not asking for money, they're thanking people, they get that wonderful feeling, and most of the time it elicits another gift because people are so excited that they got a thank you call from a real person that they say, well, maybe I will give again. So it's a wonderful way to just think about things. It's a very basic thing, but people had forgotten some of those things, I think, in the headier times of a better economy. When you look back at that Indiana study I just mentioned before, one of the things that people say that they hate the most and turns them off on giving is the over-solicitation and the lack of privacy. So not paying attention to those kinds of things, really adjusting fundraising solicitations to be appropriate and to be the number that a person wants. That's very important. It's like 90% of the reason people stopped giving to a cause was because of that very basic thing that anybody can fix. It wasn't about even their financial state. That was lower down on the list. It was about that. So we need to pay attention to those kinds of needs. The ninth trend is getting everybody to be a fundraiser. And yes, many of you are coming to specialize and learn in this, but really a lot of the best fundraisers are people who work for the nonprofit itself and are very engaged in it in different ways. At Penn, doctors wear a little button in the medical school that says, "Ask me about my research," because they want to engage anybody who's in the hospital about a conversation about the kind of work that they're doing and the developments that go on. They've been trained to learn how to be good fundraisers. They know what some of the basic things they should say should they get asked by a fairly wealthy person about their research. They know what steps to do. A lot of universities have started training more people in, and their professors to be able to go out and do things. And even at tiny nonprofits, we see the idea that everybody is a fundraiser, everybody gets trained, the receptionist who answers the phone, everyone needs to understand how to raise money. Georgetown University did an extremely successful effort where it tried to look at why some of its alumni were disengaged, and they really couldn't quite figure out why some of them had never given. So they decided what they wanted to do was they'd pay students when they were on winter break or spring break to go interview some of the alumni in their hometown. So they'd pay them $50 an interview. If they did enough interviews, they paid for their trip home for the most part. They gave the students some training. They told people who they asked, they said, "This is not a fundraising call. We really want to come and listen and hear what's going on with you and what you think about the institution." Well, these students were extremely powerful. They sold a great message. They were wonderful representatives of the institution. And the number of people who gave in response, even though this was not about giving, they were not asked to give a gift, they increased the giving among that set of alumni by 43%, just by sending out the ambassadors who were the best way to really represent what that institution is all about. Those are the kinds of things that we all have ways of thinking about how to get that message out. And instead, that's what professional fundraisers do very well to get the people who are doing the work out and the excitement of the mission. And we all need to think about doing it that way. The 10th trend is the professionalization of fundraising, of course, which is why we're all here. Fundraising has changed really dramatically. It used to be that you just had to be a people person to be the kind of person who could be a good fundraiser. But now you need to learn much, much more. You need to understand psychology. You need to understand marketing. You need to understand ethics. You need to know a whole bunch more. And you need to know more than about private donations. A lot of fundraisers are now getting involved in efforts to really work on social enterprises and think about other things beyond the private contribution. We see a lot of MBAs being recruited to these jobs to sort of think about other ways to bring money into the institution that go well beyond what we thought of in foundation work. And people need to be savvy about technology. They need to understand how to look at the various analytics that are on to make sure that the fundraising is both efficient and effective and really reaching people in very different ways. So the work of a fundraiser is going to continue to change, and it draws on lots of different fields, which is the exciting part, is to learn not just about the fundraising task, but about other areas. There's a great book called The Influential Fundraiser that didn't start out as a book about fundraising. It started out as a book about marketing by marketing experts, but the authors were working with a lot of nonprofits, and they learned a lot of techniques, and they learned that for the most part, people just weren't listening very well to their donors, and that they were just assuming that a one-size-fits-all approach worked and not really thinking about how people make decisions and about who should be asking and all of those kinds of things that really seem kind of intuitive, but people had just lost sight of it in various ways. So they wrote this book that explains all the various steps and how to listen and think in a very different way, and it's a good read to look at that kind of thing. Much as the profession is changing in all of these ways and we're learning more, we're getting more people from the scholarly world thinking about things and researching. Economics professors are looking at what happens with matching gifts and looking at incentives. And one of the things they found was that conventional wisdom about matching gifts, that the bigger the match, the more people will give, it turns out not to be true. That people, a 1-to-1 match is just as good as a 3-to-1 match in terms of things. So it's nice to have those 3-to-1 one matches, but it's not essential in terms of getting the gift. So really starting to look at the ways conventional wisdom is wrong is important. Another finding recently, there was a study called Money for Good that the Hewlett Foundation and some other foundations financed that really looked at how nonprofits raise money, and it found that a lot of them were just wasting their time. They were never going to get anywhere with their various approaches. They were trying to change their organization to be what the donor wanted rather than to be what they were good at, and they were never going to persuade these donors to change things. One of the important things that this research found was that while we all talk a lot about results and the emphasis that donors want more information about that kind of thing, and that donors today are doing more research than ever and really wanting to know about metrics and effectiveness. Well, it turns out that not many donors actually really do care about that. They want to know that the institution does well and is making a difference, but they look at that research just to validate a decision they have already made. So while the foundation world has been talking a lot about measurement, and that's very important in their world, to the average individual donor, it doesn't matter so much. So if you're doing some of these techniques just to make donors happy, that's the wrong reason to do it. If you're doing it to improve your organization, great. But it's important to start looking at this research as it gets better, because one of the things that happens in fundraising is we often have a lot of myths, and really dispelling them as much as possible is why we come to conferences like this to learn from each other. I will close with what I think is the most important fundraising lesson, which comes from a profile we did of Naomi many years ago. And one of the things that she told our reporter was about what she thought was really important is to be well-read and interesting. She picks up the New York Times right away to know what's going on. She reads widely about various things. That is a critical thing, because what donor wants to talk to you if you're not an interesting person and if you don't know about their world? And as somebody who works with words all the time, I have to say that is, of course, my favorite lesson is that reading is the right way to be a smart fundraiser. We have a lot of things to help you do that and cut down the number of things that you shouldn't read. We do a daily newsletter every day called Philanthropy Today that you can sign up. It's a free email, and we summarize all of the things that the various papers around the world are writing about in the world of philanthropy to try to make it easier so that you don't have to spend the time doing that. So I urge you to sign up for that just so that you can keep tabs on what's really going on in the world. If you want to know more about various things, we have a lot of live chats where experts come and talk to us. There are lots of other resources on our site, and I am happy to help. I mentioned a number of studies in my talk. I'm happy to help you find them. You have my card, I think, at your table, and I would love to help you find all the resources that you need. Please feel free to get in touch with that. But with that, I would love your questions about what's going on and what I can help you with. Did you want to go first? We'll do Q&A after Naomi.
A slight change of plan here. We were going to do a Q&A right now, but because of Stacy's comments, Mrs. Levine felt that her comments followed so nicely, she wanted to first say her things, and then there will be a time for conversation after that. And what better time, because Mrs. Levine, you're the star of the show, and we're lucky to have you. So please welcome Naomi Levine.
Now, most of you have come from far away, and you came here really to learn how to raise money. All the letters that you sent me made clear that you look at the United States and you say, look, they have 1.4 million nonprofits. How do you raise that money? So I'm going to be very specific. There'll be nothing inspirational in what I'll say, and I won't sing any songs like Dr. Oliva. As you heard, Oliva and Sexton, as presidents, when they thought of a song, they thought of South Pacific, You Have to Have a Dream. As a fundraiser, the only song that comes to my mind comes from 1930. You see how old I am, but I'm sure some of you may know the song, Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? So you see the difference between the president and the fundraiser. Even though my title, the title that was given to me, was the American model, I should tell you from the start that I don't believe there is any single American model. If you listen to John Sexton, you'll see that he has a way of fundraising that's very unique to him. It's a reflection of his personality, his persuasion, his vision, his enthusiasm. And then if you listen to Stacey Palmer and you heard all the trends that are now influencing fundraising, you know that they're influencing the American model. And every one of the 1.4 nonprofits that we have, I would guess, in each of those organizations, you have a special style that reflects the image of the organization and the image of its leadership. But having said that, I do believe that there is a process and there are rules. Now, Stacey talked about 10 trends. I'm going to talk about 10 rules, but I want to put those rules into some psychological and historic perspective. You know, fundraising in the United States did not begin with Bill Gates or Warren Buffett. It didn't even begin with Rockefeller and Carnegie. It began way back when this country was founded. The colonists came here, and what did they find? They found little government, hardly any government, and no money. And anything they wanted to do, they had to do themselves. If Benjamin Franklin wanted to have a firehouse in Philadelphia, he had to get his friends, collect the money, and they built it themselves. If they wanted a library, they got together, Mr. Franklin, and they put books together and money together, and they did it themselves. Every religious group that wanted a church built their church. And so you had here, right from the start, a country that had to do things themselves, get money themselves, and that became very much part of the cultural pattern, the social and cultural patterns of this country. You know, there are books that say America is very generous, etc. We don't have a special generosity gene. We're no different than anyone else, but history made us behave in a certain way. Now, having said that, I go back to my fact that, yes, we have rules, and those rules, in a way, reflect the cultural and social changes that we're aware of. I start with the first rule. Because there is so much competition in raising money, the first rule is that you have to distinguish yourself from everybody else. Why give to you and not to 1.4 other organizations that exist in this country? John Sexton said it in his own way, and I put it in a rule. When NYU started its campaign, and it was almost bankrupt, etc., how did it distinguish itself from Columbia? It had to, in some way, it didn't have a rich alumni, it had to go out to the public, it had to figure out a way how to make NYU different. And it made NYU different by saying, look at Columbia. They have a wall around them. They're isolated from the city. Not NYU. We're part and parcel of New York. You come to this university and we let you relate to the finance world, to the theatrical world. We make you part of the New York scene, and we developed that more elaborately. All I'm telling you is if you cannot devise some message that makes you unique and special, you can't raise money. That's the first rule. The second rule, your president and your CEO must be involved in the fundraising. I don't believe a word of what John Sexton said, and I know differently that he spends only 2 hours a week in fundraising. Fundraising is never out of his mind. Obviously, he doesn't sit at his desk and think, I'm doing fundraising today, but his entire relationship to the city, his entire thinking about how to attract people, his relationship with people is all part of fundraising. I don't call it fundraising, I call it development. Either you're able to develop relations or you can't raise money. But that starts on the top. And if you belong to an organization in which the president will say to you, and some of you are presidents around this table, I have a good development staff, I don't have to do fundraising, I would suggest you quit. Because you cannot do your job unless the CEO is working with you and sets a tone and makes it clear that everyone has to be involved in the process. The third rule is, You really can't do it alone, even as a president and even as a great development director. I'll take all the accolades that they give me and the medals, etc. I couldn't have raised a penny without a chairman of a board and a board who said, we will help you. They have to open the doors. They have to work with you. If I could look at an organization's board of trustees and tell you in 2 minutes whether you're going to be around in a few years or whether you will close, you must have a board that's going to work with you. And Larry, I was fortunate, Larry Titch, a great philanthropist in New York, was chairman of our board. And he said to me, and we never went public with it, I run my board by the 3 Gs. You either give money, you help get money, or you get off the board. And he made that clear. We're not Harvard, we're not Princeton, we need help. How could I open the door to the rich people in New York City? I didn't know them, and most of you don't know them. You have to have a chairman who knows that one of his functions, I'm not saying it's his only one of his functions is to help, and help put together a board that is going to open the doors so you can walk in. Because the other next rule is that the best fundraising is done by peers, together with the president and the development person. It's got to be someone who knows you. It helps. It's not the only way you raise money, but let me tell you, it's important. I said the other day to Stacy that I have a very dear friend, Lynn Meadow, who is the head of something in New York called the Manhattan Theater Group. I hate those plays that she puts on. I don't understand a word of them. They're above my head. But when Lynn Meadow comes to me and says, Naomi, make a gift, she's a good friend of mine. I'm going to make that gift. When I went out with Larry Tisch to the Chase Manhattan Bank and found out that he was the largest depositor in that bank, believe me, I got more money than if I just went straight. So one of the rules is you need a board and you need a chairman, and yet because peer-to-peer relationships are critical. And the name of the game is really development. If you look at the charts that are in the book, as Stacy pointed out, the bulk of the money, including people who give bequests, come from individuals. Individuals. Why should they give to you? Besides you having a great mission, there has to be some connection that they have, and that's called development. And I'm never sure how you do that, except I know it takes time and it takes patience, and you have to be somebody who knows things. If I'm going out with somebody who is interested in hedge funds, I have to know what a hedge fund is. If I don't know the subject, if I'm not reading, if I'm not an intelligent human being, I can't develop a relationship. If I don't want to go to lunch with you, nobody wants to go to lunch with you. And in order to do that, as Stacy said, and I don't know how to define this, you must be more than just someone who's going to ask for money. The last thing you want to do is when you sit down with somebody in an early meeting to say, could you give me $10 million? You won't get a nickel. You have to develop a rapport. Not only, that's all right, I don't need it. Not only do they have to respect your organization, but they have to respect you. They have to like you. People like John Sexton, and they see that his whole life is devoted to this institution. And he's very well read. He could talk to you about religion. He could talk to you about the Arab world. He could talk about any aspect of politics. You want to develop a relationship with him. And unless you're prepared to do that, you can't reach the individuals. And they make up most of the money you will get. 86%, as Stacy Palmer pointed out, comes from individuals. So my lesson is you got to really work very hard on that. And don't forget the annual campaigns with the telemarketing and the direct mail. You've got to include it. I know, and also you have to take advantage of the new technology. Do I believe that's going to give you big money? No, not at this point. The technology and the internet and the way they raise money, you'll get money that way. You'll get small gifts. I think, Stacy, the largest gifts coming in on that go between $1,000 and $5,000. Most of them are like $25, $50, $100. Very good, because that could eventually go up. But the big money, if you're talking about 25,000, 50,000, 10 million, 100 million, not going to come from that yet. But you have to be sophisticated in the technology. I am technologically illiterate, but I was smart enough to add to my staff someone who's an expert in social media. Do I know what the advantage of Facebook and Twitter are? To me, it's junk. I don't understand it. I don't know what it means. I don't know what it means to have 5,000 friends. I don't know what it means to have to put your whole life on the Facebook and tell your friends that you had breakfast today with cornflakes and this afternoon you're going to the theater. It doesn't mean anything, but I know it means something to 500 million people who are on it. And when 500 million people are on something, believe me, you and I have to pay a lot of attention to that, a lot of attention. And where that's going to go, none of us know, but we can't ignore it. It must be part of our thinking and how we could use it effectively in the campaigns. And then you can't forget the foundations, as was mentioned before, and the corporations. To those of you who don't come from the United States, there is an argument that goes on here about whether corporations should make gifts. A corporation is in business to give its stockholders money. And I might say to myself, why is that company in which I'm a stockholder, why is it giving out a gift? Why doesn't it give me a bigger dividend? In this country, that argument doesn't hold. We believe that corporations have a social responsibility. And so we press the corporations very hard to make their gifts. But they will answer you, some of them, and say, look, that's not our job. On the other hand, it's good business. So even if they're not motivated by altruism, they are often motivated by it's good for business. Evelyn Lauder built a huge organization on breast cancer research. And she really believes very much in the research that's being done, you know, the Pink Ribbon and the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, and their marvelous work. It also has helped her product. You know that the Lauder Cosmetics, when you buy it, part of that money is going to go to that research. So corporations give for two reasons. And I know for you overseas, when the corporations are coming to your country, believe me, don't ignore them in your fundraising efforts, because they have a business reason to help you. Now, having said all that, I should tell you that I'm not always happy, and I don't say this in class because it's not appropriate for me to say it in class. I teach philanthropy. But I say to myself, is it a good idea that I'm dependent on the Rockefellers and the Carnegies for my great museums? Is it a good idea that I have to depend on the donors to keep this university alive? And I look at Bill Gates, and he poured $1 billion into charter schools. Charter schools, in my opinion, will destroy public education. And I say, who is he to make a decision to destroy public education? On the other hand, it's his money and his right. And I am conflicted in my notions about the role of philanthropy in our society. In Europe, many of the things that are made possible by donors here are paid for by the government. So while the American model is a good model, let me tell you, I sometimes worry about it. I worry about what it means. And I'm not the only one who worried about it. I should tell you that George Washington, in his farewell address, and this I'd like to read to you, to the United States Congress, was very worried about it. And I'll give you his exact language, because it amazed me to think that he thought of something back in those days that here it is. Here's George Washington. He says, I am very worried about all combinations and associations representing a small minority of the community, which may often be ambitious and unprincipled, who will then subvert the power of the people and by their private associations usurp for themselves the power of government. And it's made an impression on me because, in a sense, that's what happens. We don't complain about it here because look what it gave us. It gave us great museums and great universities and hospitals. Look at New York. You wouldn't have Columbia, you wouldn't have NYU, you wouldn't have Fordham, you wouldn't have Pace, you wouldn't have Sloan Kettering, you wouldn't have the great hospitals. And so I don't negate the value of philanthropy, but I worry. There was an article in the New York Times recently about how some very big donors are trying to direct the academic substance of Catholic schools. And in the article, it begins by saying, private philanthropy has changed the face of public education in the last decade, underwriting the rise of charter schools and prompting remedies that rely heavily on student testing, teacher evaluation, and reducing the power of teachers' unions. I happen to be a child of union people. I believe in them. And yet, I have very little power as against the billions that are being poured in by the people with money. And the philosophers have said it better than I. I'll read one of them who said, all the way back in George Washington's time, the critical paradox of American life is the coexistence of ideals of political equality expressed in our laws and the unequal distribution of wealth which gives to some people more power than to others. That is the form of our government and the American model. So you have to think, as you develop your model, what's good about our model and what's bad. We're not here today, I certainly am not, to tell you that the American model is the only and the best. On the contrary, as I read what some of you are doing from all over the world, we have a lot to learn from you. And we're doing well, and we've done well, but there are these problems which thoughtful leaders like you should begin to think about. Now, Stacy talked about professionalizing the world of philanthropy and fundraising. No mother wakes up in the morning and says to her child, I want you to grow up to be a fundraiser. That's not the way it is. It has no standing in the world of profession. I'll be personal and tell you that when I used to visit my mother in her last days at a nursing home, and we would go down for lunch, every time I met her and went for lunch, she would say to me, now look, if somebody asks you what you do for a living, tell them you're a lawyer, not a fundraiser. My own mother was ashamed that her law review daughter, instead of being on the Supreme Court, was selling cookies for the Girl Scouts. And it's not a profession today. It is not recognized as a profession today. We are struggling to make it a profession, but it isn't. But let me tell you that in many ways it is. And the qualities that Stacy Palmer made a list of are very important qualities for that fundraiser. Yes, you have to be a psychiatrist. I have to be able to read you and know what button to push to get you to give me $30 million. That's not an easy thing to do. I have to be a salesman. I have to be able to sell an idea. I have to be a teacher. I have to be able to explain it and understand it in a way that's going to move you. I have to be a lawyer because there are things involving ethics and law that are very much related. I have to be an accountant. I have to be able to read a budget. I have to be able to talk. I have to be able to write. These are difficult skills, as difficult as any other profession. And it is up to you, who are the leaders in your country, who have traveled long distances, to begin to think that way. Academics don't. Many of you in this room are academics. And you look down on the fundraisers because you're an expert in ancient Greek and Roman mythology, and you don't really have much respect for the people who are talking so crassly about money. But keep in mind, you wouldn't be in this building without the thousands of fundraisers who made it possible. You wouldn't have the medical research or the hospitals or anything you enjoy without the people in the back room who are raising the money so the professors could have their chairs and go on with their research. So it is your job Not mine anymore. I'm too old. I'm 88. So I leave it to you. I leave it to you to carry that torch and make it a real profession. Thank you. Now, Stacy and I are going to take questions because what we said is really interrelated. So if you don't mind, just ask whatever questions come in your head, direct them to her or to me, and we'll try. We have now, it's 11:49. We have a few minutes left for lunch. Any questions that you can think of that we can help you so when you leave, you've learned something about fundraising.
Stacy, I just wanted to have you talk a little bit more. There's some contradictions in what you said, but no surprise. Not you, but just that there are contradictions. And you talked about the growing or the increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots. This is one contradiction. At the same time that our younger, up-and-coming generation of philanthropists are looking to support those have-not type organizations as opposed to their traditional, college, university, prep school, et cetera. So both of those seem to be going on at the same time. So that's one. And the second is your mention about entrepreneurs. I think it depends, and I'd like you, if you can elaborate on this a little bit, when it is you go to talk to an entrepreneur, because there's definitely a time in the entrepreneur's cycle where the only thing, and the reason they're successful, the only thing they're thinking about is putting money into whatever it is their dream is, their idea is, and the ability to really talk to them about getting outside of that. It takes some time after they're well established. At least that's been my experience. So if you could address those two.
Stacy, that's too hard for me. Would you try to answer that question?
And since I'm the one who had the contradictions, I have to explain myself, which is absolutely true. And that's the thing that I love about covering the world of philanthropy. It's so not black and white. There are just all of these things that are going on. And so, the haves and the have-nots issue is both about the groups themselves and the people who are getting served. And what I see a lot of is people coming up with their own new ideas and not necessarily doing research to find out that other people have already sort of made some of these mistakes and figured some of these things out, and just sort of starting their own organization, sometimes for ego trips or for other kinds of reasons. Those are not the right reasons to start a nonprofit. There are great reasons to start a nonprofit if you find that nobody had your idea and nobody's doing it well. And there are some communities that are not well served, certainly by nonprofits. But I think one of the things that happens sometimes is we spend so much resources on forming organizations instead of actually doing the work and learning from each other. That's what really I find very difficult. And that's a part of that new, shall we say, entrepreneurial idea that some of these younger donors have, as if they just stumbled on some of these things for the first time. I will sound like a very old person, I suspect, when I say this, but it kind of drives me nuts when people say that social entrepreneurs were just invented. This is the new term of art, but I kind of think the Ford Foundation has been financing them for a really long time, and that's what they've always been about, starting these wonderful organizations. Some of you may be in the room because of those organizations, and that was quite a while ago. It's not hip anymore for them to do it, and they didn't have that wonderful name of social entrepreneurs, but that's exactly what they were. They were nonprofit leaders who came in and wanted to start and do something. So we seem to spend a lot of time in this field reinventing and doing all of that, and that's where I feel like the needs are too great right now, and we can't do that. So that's what worries me about some of these new philanthropists, who sometimes don't really check those things out, and that's part of what is both the good and the bad. They're questioning, they're frustrated. A lot of things in the nonprofit world don't work. We haven't solved poverty or any of those kinds of things that we should be better at. So it's right that they're asking the questions, but we need to find a way to channel that energy into different ways. And so I think when I look at what some of the newer donors are thinking about, that's kind of what is on my mind. The specific concern I have about the haves versus the have-nots is just that the need is continuing in some groups. There's Paul Light, who teaches at the Wagner School, talks about these service deserts that are existing in various places because nonprofits are just shutting their doors. I mean, that's what doesn't get written about very much, is the number of, when a nonprofit disappears, nobody says, oh, unless it's a really big institution, you know, we had one group fall off the Philanthropy 400, the list of the 400 organizations. It completely shut its doors, one of the biggest nonprofit institutions in the country because of the bad economy. But that doesn't happen very often. That made headlines because it happened. There are lots of these small, fragile groups that are really starting to shut down. Those are the kinds of things that I worry about the most. So
you know, I have in front of me the list of the 50 biggest donors in our country. And most of them, except one or two, are older people, you know, 65 and older, 50 and older. And they were all entrepreneurs. So I have great difficulty when I hear people talk about the new generation, the younger people are entrepreneurs. What do you think Larry Tisch was? He started with a hotel, and he was an entrepreneur. What do you think Leonard Stern was? His father was selling canaries. He took it and he built a business out of it. Every one of the major donors I had were entrepreneurs. So I don't know what these younger, and it may be my age blocks my vision in a way. I don't know what we're talking about. I know that they all come in and they say we're entrepreneurs. Well, who do you think these people are? I start with George Soros. You don't think he was an entrepreneur? The second one is Bloomberg. Mayor Bloomberg, who gave $279 million. You don't think his whatever he does on television isn't an entrepreneurship? And then it goes down. Most of them are in finance, investment, manufacturing, all that is. So I know that there is a lot of talk about the younger people and they're bringing a different spirit. I'm never sure what that is. I also hear the younger people want to be involved more. Let me tell you, when someone ever gave me a check of $1 million, they didn't say, here, Naomi, and then they went away. They were there. They wanted to be on the board of trustees. They wanted to pick the furniture of the Kimmel Center that they were funding. They wanted to be involved in everything. So now you say the younger people want to be involved. What do you think the older people were? Do you think that Dame Shirley gave her check and walked away? She told you last night. She was deeply involved in everything. So maybe somebody who's younger than me can answer that. What am I missing in this? I don't see much difference between the younger and the older. And I'll tell you, Stacy, where I don't think the book on women is a book that I agree with. And so let me say, the book says that you handle women different in fundraising. I never understood that. If I have a good project and I go to my friend Bernice Manicherian and I say, Bernice, I have a project and I'm going to explain it to you and you'll tell me whether you like it or not. If I go to Al Asher, I'm not going to use different language. I'm going to see Albert. Here's the project. To talk to me differently than you're going to talk to him is an insult to me as a woman. So, Stacy, since you raised a point, why don't you take me on that?
I would never take you on, but I think what the book's point actually is that it's not even that you approach women differently. It's actually to get away from some of those myths. It's to say that women do give and to really talk about what it is that interests them and what, you know, has made them work. The real thing that is disturbing is that women control much of the money, probably more than half of it, and yet that they're not asked very often and they're not taken seriously. They're not put on boards. Fortunately, we have more women college presidents and things like that, but you know, it's just women still in the world of philanthropy. It's a very tiny percentage compared to the way the rest of the world is, and it's true of minorities as well. We've done surveys of the chief executives of the biggest nonprofits and of the top fundraisers, and women are not as well represented, minorities are not as well represented as they should be, and this sector is the one that should be the inclusive one and that should reach out and represent really everybody, especially if you're going to raise money, you really need to be able to represent everyone. And yet we haven't done a great job at that yet. And that's one of the conundrums of the nonprofit world that still needs to be solved. At the very highest echelons, we haven't really seen quite enough change.
Can we have some more questions? Yes, ma'am. Give your name, please.
Thank you. I'm Ankur Mangalagiri. I'm from Hunter College. Speaking of women college presidents, we do have one, Jennifer Rabb. And Ms. Levine, thank you so much for having us here and for this wonderful program. It's really an honor to be here. I just wanted to ask you both, in fact, what do you see the trend in public-private partnerships has been, and where do you think it's going? I know both of you touched on the importance of individuals and the rising, importance of individual givers, the 26-year-olds and so forth, but there is only one Mark Zuckerberg. Where do you think public-private partnerships are? At Hunter College, for instance, the downturn actually worked to our advantage. It was a blockbuster year that we had in fundraising in the last fiscal year, and a lot of it came from public-private partnerships. The state matched one of our gifts from a private person, a $40 million infusion for a new campus in East Harlem, and I think we're only the third institution in New York that is actually constructing, and the building is going up in East Harlem. We also had an anonymous donor who gave to women college presidents all over the country $1 million, up to the president's discretion on how it should be applied, and then the rest of the $4 million went towards scholarships for women. So what do you think where is public-private partnership and public-private fundraising going? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure I know the answer. I believe in partnerships. Doug or Stacy, could you answer her a little better than I think I can?
I think these partnerships are wonderful, but government has no money. And I think, the reality of what's going to happen in the United States is what's happening around the world, is that governments are pulling back in a lot of ways and asking philanthropy to do more. So I think we're going to see more creative partnerships, but we have to realize that most of the time they're not really about partnerships. They're really about private money coming in and taking over for some of the things that government used to do. That's what we're going to see at least over the next few years in this country as things are changing. So there's, one of the things that Dame Shirley talked about was talking to the Office of Social Innovation in the White House. Well, that's a tiny little office with a tiny amount of money, and it's exciting that they're thinking about those things, but when you look at the bulk of financing, and nonprofits in America get more money from government than they do from private donations or from fees or from anything else. It's hugely important, but it's going to decrease over the next few years. So you have to be creative about it, but I think we have to realize that in some ways by being successful at fundraising, that is allowing government in some ways to say, okay, well, that works, so let the private government do it. And in California, foundations have been asked to pay for some very basic services, and they said, no, that's not our role. We don't do that. And by the way, thank you very much. We write one check, we'll be gone. There will not be, the scale of philanthropy is just so much smaller than government. So
I have some, yes, ma'am.
I'm Carmela Heshe from NYU. I'm just wondering that within the United States, our growing population is among the immigrant community, and so many here are from other countries. I'm wondering if you can speak to any trends related to how we are developing fundraising and gift giving within the immigrant community, and perhaps how that can help their countries back home as well.
You certainly have to understand the culture and the background of countries. I myself feel that all people are generous and all people want to give to causes they believe in. And so I'm not sure that I would use any different technique if I had a project that I believed was of interest to people. I know we have people in the Chinese community and the Puerto Rican community and all the immigrant communities that come here. Don't forget, religion. I said before that fundraising didn't start with even the colonists. It is in the Jewish tradition, the Islamic tradition, and the Christian tradition. People have given for millions, for thousands of years. It's just a question of explaining, I believe, and giving them a project that means something. In some ways, and Stacy pointed it, I think, out in some articles, that poorer people give a higher percentage. They may not be able to give a lot, but they give a higher percentage to some of our richest people. So I'm not sure there are different techniques. You have to understand the culture. And if it's a poor community just getting started, you're not going to come in and ask for $30 million. You may ask for something that you think they're concerned about. So I'm not sure I can answer that better than this very vague response. I just think that all of the countries that are sitting in this room, all of them, and we have a great many, and we have France, and we have Germany, and here I have the list. And we have Australia and Spain and Puerto Rico and South Africa and Canada, Ireland, Sweden, England, Germany. These people are all beginning to raise money now. And they all recognize the importance. That's why they're here today. So I think communities all over the world, now that the government is cutting back, and they have to go out and get private money. One point that I want to, 2 points I want to just end with, because we have lunch now, and then we have a very important afternoon, 2 very important afternoon sessions. I think we have foundations, corporations, we have technology with 2 really great people in that field. But let me end on something. You know, we live in a post-Enron era, in a post-Madoff era, and a lot of the mismanagement, excess salaries, even criminal behavior that has occurred in corporate America has spilled over to the nonprofit world. Doug White has written 2 books. I'm sorry I didn't bring them here. I don't sell books, but these 2 books are so important, pointing out in Charities on Trial the many cases that have occurred, whether it's United Way, where they were stealing, where there were at universities like Adelphi and others doing really bad things. And my feeling has been that our government here has very little oversight, if any, of the nonprofit sector. And it bothers me. There is no SEC for the nonprofit world. There's no Federal Trade Commission. Our 1.4 nonprofits just work in the air. Nobody supervises them, only the IRS. And it isn't only tax issues that are involved. There are many issues involved. Now, Dame Shirley last night indicated that Obama set up a special division on innovation in the nonprofit world, and maybe that's a beginning. But where I'm concerned that there is no real oversight or involvement with these 1.4 nonprofits. That's a mistake, and the nonprofits have fought against any effort to have them regulated in any way, because nobody likes, whether you're a corporation or a nonprofit, to be regulated. I would hope in your countries where the government is more involved that we might have a better development this way, and we could learn from you in that. And last, I have one more story about my mother. All of the meetings that I had with Larry Tisch were at the Regency Hotel because he owned it. And I would take the donors there, and I would take the prospective donors there for breakfast or lunch or dinner. And my mother, every time I visit her, she would say, what do you do? What does a fundraiser do? What do you do to make a living? And I would get very impatient with that. I couldn't stand that question already. And one day, in irritation, I said, listen, Ma, I have breakfast at the Regency, have lunch at the Regency, I have dinner, and then someone dies and leaves me money. So she looked at me and said, if that's what you do, why don't you have breakfast at Cathay House? More people die here than at the Regency. Enjoy your lunch. That was just to put some humor into a very serious subject. Thank you for listening to us.